From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Face the State on the Montana Television Network. I'm Mike Dennison, MTN's Chief Political Reporter. I'm joined today by my co-host, Montana State University political scientist and MTN analyst David Parker. As you no doubt know, it's campaign season in Montana, and millions of dollars are being spent on campaign ads, mailers, and other efforts to influence the outcome of the 2018 election. Today we're going to zero in on that money, where it's coming from, how it's regulated in Montana and nationally, and how you, the voter, can track it and find out more about it. To help us do that, we have two guests with plenty of background on this issue. Jamie McNaughton is lead counsel for Montana's Commissioner of Political Practices, which is the frontline enforcer of campaign finance laws in the state. And Denise Roth-Barber is the managing director at the National Institute on Money and State Politics, perhaps better known by its website, followthemoney.org. Welcome both of you to the show. And Denise, let's start with you. Let's talk about the National Institute, just what it does and how it tracks campaign spending.
So we are a national nonprofit organization located here in Helena, Montana. And what we do is we collect the campaign finance reports filed by everybody across the entire country who runs for state and federal office. We also collect the campaign finance reports by state party committees and ballot measure committees. And we put this all together into our website, followthemoney.org. We clean the data to standardize the donor names, for example, and assign economic industry codes. And then that data is now available to the public for free to allow them to look into who is funding their own their races, their district races, maybe what's going on in the state, how to compare Montana to other states across the country, and it's all for free.
So if you want to, if you're just a consumer, you can track everything from a state legislative race all the way up to races for Congress on your website.
That's right.
And Jamie, let's talk a little bit about the Commissioner's Office. Sure. Tell me its role in enforcing campaign finance laws in Montana.
Our role's kind of dual. We both educate and help people comply with the law, but we also enforce the law if there are campaign practice violations that occur. So we have a staff of right now of 6 people, 3.5 or so who work on the compliance and 3 in the other half who work on enforcement actions. And we have all of the reports for any state election. So we don't regulate federal, we only regulate state, from the governor all the way down to your local elections.
And give me an example of a type of complaint you would investigate. Or
I'd say the most common one is attribution, and that one we don't even investigate that much anymore. But somebody gets a mailer or hears an advertisement on radio or on television and they don't know who funded that communication. And so they'll call us up and try and track it down. And our next step now is to immediately try and track it down, contact them and get it to correct it so that the public will know who's financing those communications.
So we have a film that's been showing around the state called Dark Money. It was originally shown at Sundance, and of course it's about campaign finance. But I think a lot of the voters get confused about all the money that's coming in, that's being spent. So let's just start and spend a little bit of time kind of laying the landscape out there. What is dark money, Denise? What defines dark money?
Dark money is essentially secret donors. So we know the money that's being spent and by whom. Maybe it's, let's say Committee for a Better Montana, whatever their agenda is. If an individual gives to that committee and they report that, we know who the individual is. We know who if a corporation gives, we know who they are. But oftentimes you'll have a tax-exempt group giving to the spender, and we can't find out who funded the donor. So you might have a donor giving $2 million, and all you have is their name, and the trail runs cold after that, so that's dark money. Who funded that $2 million?
And this is money that, of course, it could be dark money at the federal level, but also at the state level too.
And for me, I would add a qualifier to it. I think it's dark money if it happens, the voter doesn't show up at the booth with the information that they need. If we find out disclosure, down the road from the IRS or from other organizations, it was still dark for that election. Nobody knew when they were going to the polls who spent that money to influence their vote.
And I think we should be clear here that when we talk about dark money, aren't we talking about money that's being given to committees that are spending to try to influence the election. We're not talking about contributions to candidates, because that's all reported.
Right.
So we're talking about giving to outside third-party groups that are buying these ads saying, vote against this guy, or this guy is a rotten person, or this guy's a good person.
Right.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, the independent spenders.
Okay.
So if I'm a federal candidate for office, or if I'm a state candidate for office,
Right.
I receive money, I have to report it. And there's certain kinds of money I can't get, right?
Right.
Like, for example, what can't I take as a candidate
Corporate
here?
contributions.
So I can't take corporate contributions.
Right. There's a limit on what you can take from political action committees or political committees. There's a limit on what you can take from political party committees here in Montana. So there's a certain amount that you can go up to.
And I can't take money from labor unions either directly.
Correct.
Political action committees, yes.
I kind of count them as corporations, but yeah.
But same thing at the federal level, too.
That's right.
Okay.
Right, so there's limits on what can be given directly to candidates by various types of donors, the ones you just spoke of. Corporations are prohibited from giving directly, but if a corporation wants to influence an election by spending money, they can easily do so by giving to an independent spending group. And they could give unlimited amounts of money.
So it's fair to say that if you have a bunch of money and you want to spend it to influence an election, you can probably find a way to do it somehow that's legal.
As long as it's not directly to the candidate, that's correct.
Okay.
Well, let's go a little bit deeper here, all right? So, how long has dark money been around? That's a tricky question,
That is
right?
a tricky question. Well, the soft money that often is talked about, that the McCain-Feingold congressional law passed in 2002, that was banned, that was actually disclosed. So that wasn't dark money. So basically it started essentially when the Supreme Court passed or ruled on Citizens United, saying that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money. Subsequent rulings then from the Federal Election Commission and other smaller courts have essentially allowed for these committees to form that could receive the new soft money.
But why isn't that disclosed? Because it's Citizens United. That's the issue here, right? I mean, why isn't it disclosed?
Actually, Citizens United doesn't have any bearing on why it's not disclosed. What's not disclosed is when a nonprofit gives to these independent spending committees, right? And that was a workaround that people have figured out. Oh, I know, if I don't want to give directly to the spender and expose my giving, I'm just going to give to a tax-exempt group or non-profit group. And then they could give, and they don't have to report their donors to the IRS. Because that's just an agreement with the IRS. In exchange for being a social welfare group or an organization that's not entirely political, you don't have to pay taxes, but you do have to file some reports, but the donors that they file are not publicly available.
And these are 501c4s primarily.
And C6 is the trade association, so like the Chamber of Commerce's. They don't have to report their donors. Well, they do report to the IRS. It's the IRS that doesn't have to disclose that information to the public.
Yeah. Why is it the IRS's business and not the Federal Election Commission?
Well, it's both. So
Okay.
it's just when those tax-exempt groups jump into elections, then it becomes, then all of a sudden, in terms of the groups like us who want to follow the money, we look and we find Committee for a Greater America giving to a Committee for Great America. And we're like, well, who's Committee for a Greater America? Well, we don't know because their information is not disclosed.
Now you mentioned Citizens United, of course, the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court decision. I'd like to go to Jamie. People talk about Citizens United and just kind of blame it for everything and say it just unleashed the dogs everywhere. Let's tell our viewers just what Citizens United did and what it allowed and what it didn't do.
Sure. The simple way to say it is it allowed corporations and unions to directly make independent expenditures in candidate races. But what it also did is it reinforced it by allowing that. The reason that was permissible is because we would have reporting and disclosure that was immediately available to the public. And therefore so corporate contributions unconstitutional, reporting and disclosure, states are allowed to do it, and the federal government.
And so before that, if I was a corporation, or ran a corporation or a labor union, I could not spend directly on ads saying, vote for this person or don't vote for that person.
Correct.
And then once that came down, then you could spend whatever you wanted on that.
Right, and the floodgates opened.
Right, but as you said, the decision said, but we still should have disclosure. So how do we go from that to the point now where we have a lot of points where there's not disclosure?
Well, one of the things that we did, or Montanans did in 2015, is we passed the Disclose Act through the legislature. And the Disclose Act added reporting and disclosure for electioneering communications. And electioneering communications, a lot of the argument in the regulation community has been about whether something is express advocacy versus issue advocacy. And what electioneering communications gets around is that argument. It says, if you're identifying a candidate within a certain period of time before the election, and it's reachable by 100 people in your district. And
60 days at the time.
60, yeah. Well, we do it when the absentee ballots are mailed to Montanans here in Montana. That's when our electioneering period starts. So it's going on right now.
Okay.
And they have to report and disclose at a minimum the amount of money that they spent on that expenditure and who it was to support or oppose to our offices. So that's increased disclosure that's happened.
Can one of you unpack the difference between express advocacy? So the idea is that there's express advocacy and not direct or not express advocacy, or another way of putting it would be electioneering versus issue advocacy. What are the differences between those terms?
Well, express advocacy, the first test is Buckley versus Vail, the magic words.
Magic words test.
The magic words test. The second is the functional equivalent of express advocacy, and that is looking at a lot of the characteristics of what an electioneering communication has. Is it, are we close to election? Are you mentioning candidate? Are you talking about their qualifications? And that's a Roberts decision on Wisconsin right to life decision that came down.
So the key here is closeness to the election.
There are many factors.
And message.
Right.
So if a message says vote for or against, that's express advocacy. That is.
You have to report that.
You have to report that.
Where the money's coming from, where it's being spent.
Right. If it's an issue ad, where you identify a person who is running for election, and it runs, the ad or communication goes out within a certain window of time, but you stop short of saying vote for or against this person, then that's an issue ad or electioneering communication.
So I say John Tester or Matt Rosedale's not a nice man, and I do it 65 days before the election. What kind of, is that express?
Are you Matt Rosendale or are you
No,
a person?
I'm a group.
Okay, that's issue ad.
Okay, if I say that within 25 days of an election,
Electioneering communication.
why?
But I think that's a bad example because he said Matt Rosendale or John Tester.
Well, that's true.
The law in Montana applies only to state races. It does
That's
not
correct.
apply to
Okay.
federal races. Yes.
Good point. So Steve Bullock.
Yeah, okay, Steve Bullock. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, then yes, it would be an electioneering communication. If you spent more than $250 to it and it goes to more than 100 people in Montana, Steve Bullock's a statewide race, so his district's the entire state. And
However, though, if I said that in the federal race within 30 days of an election, it's electioneering, though. And it has to be reported, correct?
60 days before a general and 30 days before a primary. So if I'm a part of an issue group and Senator Tester does something that we approve or disapprove of, we can communicate that to the public. But the minute we do that within the window of time as defined by law, which is 30 days before a primary and 60 days before a general, or maybe that's 90, I think it's 60, then that same communication that was an issue ad turns into an electioneering communications because it's a communications we're conducting during an election that identifies a candidate. But we're stopping short of saying vote for or against.
So you're saying that there's also there's federal disclosure rules too, like our ones here in the state, that after a certain period, if you mention someone's name, a candidate's name, what do you have to disclose then?
How much you spent and where the money came from.
The donors, essentially.
Right.
You do, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So I can see why this is confusing for voters, right? Because we have
Yeah, we're confused ourselves. Yeah,
so we got dark money up to a point, but one of the things here in the Montana race is at the end of the day, if it's within that window, as long as you mention a state candidate, it's got to be basically disclosed.
or even local or.
So what happens if someone doesn't do that? What if I'm a group and I'm within the 60-day window and I run these issue ads and I'm naming a candidate running for state office and I don't file anything? And what happens?
Generally, we find out about those because our office is here in Helena. We find out about those by people calling our office and asking about it and complaining and saying, I'm not seeing that on the report. Then we follow up with the candidate or the committee and we say, what's going on here? But we handle the complaints that come in and sort out the facts and come up with the answers and put it out in a sufficiency decision or a dismissal from the commissioner's office.
And so you're going to, in other words, you're going to do what you can to force those people to comply and report
Correct.
what they've done and where they're getting their money.
Yes.
Okay.
What's the cost of a violation? Let's say you find that it did happen, money was spent, wasn't properly disclosed. What could happen to me?
Well, you could end up in court. Or you could end up trying to settle something with me. But the violations are either $500 or 3 times the amount of the contribution or expenditure, whichever's more, is what the law says.
Now, Denise, you've been watching this unfold here in Montana, and you've seen kind of the national picture as well. I had a couple questions. First of all, how unique is Montana's Disclose Act in terms of what it's requiring and what's attempting to do? And second, do you think it's been effective?
So yes, it's definitely been effective in requiring stronger disclosure. What is probably the most unique feature of that is what Jamie mentioned earlier, which is the window of time is fairly long. It's longer than most states. But with regards to electioneering communications and direct advocacy type disclosure, the Disclose Act brought Montana up to speed. And so it's very comparable to probably about half of the states.
Okay.
Right.
So let's look at the big picture here. Citizens United happens 2010. What's the trend that's occurred since Citizens United in terms of federal elections? And then we talk state elections.
Right. So we've seen a tremendous increase in independent spending since Citizens United. And definitely a corresponding decrease in disclosure since Citizens United as people have figured out the disclosure loopholes to prevent disclosure.
So in terms of federal spending, is most of the money still spent by candidates and political parties and political action committees or not?
That's a great question. You know, not every federal race is targeted by independent spenders. So I don't have off the top of my head the total raised by candidates and party committees compared to total independent spending. But those races that are targeted, including Montana races, even though Montana is a really small state nationally, just from population, we're always in the limelight as far as our very contested congressional and Senate races. So a lot of money is spent on these races independently, as well as being raised by candidates. But remember, candidates are limited in what they can raise.
If I went back to 2012, I seem to recall that basically Senator Tester, Congressman Rehberg, when they ran in that Senate race, they spent about half the money that was spent, and the other half was outside money, independent spending. What about right now? What's roughly the scene right now between Matt Rosendale and John Tester?
I don't have those figures right now as far as what they're spending and raising. I mean, we believe it's going to be another record year. But even though it's already September, it's really kind of early. The majority of money that gets spent on races is starting now through October. So regardless of what it is today, everything's going to change in the next 2 months.
Well, I mean, I can speak from experience in covering the race and covering this race, that so far I think the money in this race, meaning Matt Rosendale versus Senator Tester and also Libertarian Rick Breckenridge in the race as well, that so far it seems to me it hasn't really reached the escalated level of 2012 race between Rehberg and Tester, but there's still time, as Denise said. One thing I'd like to ask the both of you is, we were talking about the Disclose Act here in Montana, and mostly in a positive light, that it's shedding more light in the system, but there are some people who don't like it and say it's a bad thing. And for example, Americans for Prosperity is a group that is saying, I'm not going to disclose any of our donors. And one of the things they say is that it forces the group to give to the government information about our donors, which can then be disseminated publicly. Well, what do you make of that argument, Denise?
So a little known fact is one of the rulings of Citizens United was the Supreme Court, by an 8-to-1 ruling, affirmed government's right to require disclosure. In other words, the public's right to know. In fact, that was the basis for allowing unlimited spending. They said it's going to be all right because the public's going to know who's spending. Now, they weren't correct on that, as time has told, but the U.S. Supreme Court says you can spend as freely as you want. That is your First Amendment right. But it's also the public's right to know about your spending, because you're trying to influence the outcome of elections and thus policies. And we live in a democracy, and we have the right to know.
Well, and you've kind of answered my next question too as well, and Jamie, you can chime in on this as well, is that the other argument kind of related to that is that this kills free speech, because once the public knows that I have given money to a cause, then I can become a target of boycotts or other forms of retribution. Do you think that's a legitimate argument?
Well, the cases that have gone up haven't been able to show that yet, and the ones that I've been able to see. But I would also disagree with the fact that their contributors become public. If you are engaging in electioneering communication, which Americans for Prosperity does, they don't have to report and disclose who their contributors are or their membership list unless they solicited money for those communications. Then when that contribution is earmarked, then you have to report and disclose it. But you don't have to otherwise.
Yeah, but doesn't this, Jamie, doesn't this kind of go up against the position of the Supreme Court and the right to association of the First Amendment and the NAACP decision in the early 60s, which basically, in that case, the state government of Alabama was trying to get the membership list of, I think it was Alabama, the membership list of the NAACP, and the concern was that membership list would be used to basically harass members of NAACP.
And was used.
And it was. So what about flip that around? If I am soliciting money to engage in electioneering, and then I have to release those individuals, aren't I basically the government now putting folks in a position where they may not be wanting to do that because they could be attacked?
I'm sure that people feel like they're in that position, but that's not actually what's happening. And when we've gone, and not only just Montana, but other states have gone to court and tried to prove that, there haven't been a sufficient showing yet that I'm aware of that people are actually being threatened or harassed as a result of this increased disclosure.
Is it fair to say, or do you think that, looking at that argument, that disclosure that's the price you pay? I mean, if you're going to be involved in the political process, then you're going to be disclosed, and the public should know about who's spending what to influence elections. That's what we're saying, essentially.
Essentially.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And but to your point about membership and the right to freely associate without feeling any kind of a backlash in any way, the solution to that then would be for all of those social welfare groups like NAACP back then and many now, is these groups could form a separate segregated fund that tracks only the money coming and going to fund their political activity, and then all of the other income from those groups, such as membership income and thus the membership list, that does not have to be disclosed.
And in fact, most organizations do have these segregated accounts. They do have these I mean, that's.
And if they don't, they can. I mean, it's easy, right? We all right now we have checking accounts and saving accounts. If we have kids, hopefully we have a college savings account. If we have enough money, hopefully we have investment accounts, right? And each one of those accounts has a different set of rules and regulations. We're capable of managing different buckets of money. These groups are capable as well, but many just don't want to.
Let's talk a little more about tracking this money, where it comes from, and how to follow the money. Of course, as members of the media, I mean, I occasionally write stories about where it's coming from, but there's so much going on out there. I can't do it all, neither can other reporters. How about the individual person or voter who sees an ad on TV or sees a candidate and says, I want to find out who's funding this guy? How much money has John Tester received? Where is it coming from? What are some of the sources they can look at to do that themselves?
Well, they can go to followthemoney.org,
of course, yeah.
which is our website.
Yeah.
We don't have like minute by minute updates. So if somebody gave last week, we might not have it right then and there. You can go to the state's website and look at the reports filed directly. You can look at the original source of the reports. You could go to the Federal Election Commission, and that's where the candidates file their reports. And our sister group, OpenSecrets.org, they have the federal data.
Center for Responsive Politics.
Right,
yes.
Center for Responsive Politics. They have kind of up
Very
to the
good
minute.
website.
All right, let's pretend I'm that citizen for a moment. I have spent time at the Follow the Money website. I've spent a lot of time at the FEC website. I do a lot of stuff in campaign finance. I can go get information and the money's being spent, but one of the things that frustrates the living heck out of me is I go there and I see the name of an organization. I don't know anything else about this organization. I might go to they may have a website, they may not have a website, nothing. And they might disappear. I mean, we've seen this with Western Tradition Partnership and American Tradition Partnership. I'm skeptical that transparency, at least right now, is that meaningful, since there's very little requirement to actually tell me much more about these groups. How would you answer that, either one of you?
I would say it's true. They didn't report and disclose those groups that came in and spent in Montana elections. But one of my favorite things from early on at the office, someone called up and they said, "I can't find this anywhere on your site." And I said, "Well, let me look." I looked for it, couldn't find it either. And he said, "Well, I'm going to round bend it. I'm not going to pay any attention to the message. If I can't find information about who's trying to influence my vote, I'm going to ignore their message." And people have taken that kind of action. And I think it's important to rely on people who are here election after election, groups who are speaking to us that we know, people we know who are giving to those organizations. You look for people who you trust and know. That's what Montanans do. I mean, most elections around here are won based on knocking on doors and talking to individuals. So I understand the frustration, but there's also the choice to not listen to the message.
And you also mentioned earlier in the show, you talked about, here's one group that has spent on this, and you go look at who they are and where they're getting their money. They're getting money from another group, who gets money from another group.
Right.
So even if that stuff is disclosed, it can still be pretty hard to follow, even for people who are experienced at doing it.
Right. Right. I mean, there are definitely ways to hide or obfuscate your money. And that does make it more difficult for the citizens. And that's why the Supreme Court, when they ruled on Citizens United, the premise was, well, as long as we have really good disclosure. Well, we don't have really good disclosure. So.
Well, let's pretend that you could have the dream disclosure regimen. Jamie, what's one thing you would do? And Denise, what's one thing that you would do?
I would like to go back to the other groups, absolutely. And I mean, one of the great things that the Disclose Act has made it electronic. So it's, as soon as we get it, it's available to you now to the state district level. We're going to try and get that back. We're going to get reporting. We're going to try and get another reporting period earlier. But a dream would be I have access to their checkbooks on the day that they spent it. But that's not the way that reporting and disclosure works.
Yeah, so what can we do to improve things?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we would require these nonprofits to have a segregated political fund that would be thoroughly disclosed to the public, whether it's to the state agency or the federal agency overseeing their elections. We would also broaden the window of time that the issue ads are considered electioneering communications, because as we all know from our own experience, these elections now run in perpetuity almost. So not saying that we want it forever, but maybe we need to lengthen the window of time from 60 days before a federal election to perhaps, we don't know the window, but it should be broader than what it is. What was the other? I had a few more, but I can't remember. But those are two good ones.
Well, you mentioned, I mean, electronic filing also is kind of a must too. I mean, we just a couple weeks ago, we had the Senate, U.S. Senate, finally requiring its members, not yet, well, it hasn't passed yet, that's right. Well,
or it has been signed in law.
Yeah, right, okay. But requires members to file their reports electronically. Before it's just paper, and the House is electronically, and so that's kind of a key thing as well. We're just about the end of our show now. I want to thank our guests, Jamie McNaughton and Denise Roth-Barber, for being here this morning to talk about campaign finance, how to track the money in Montana. There's lots of money out there in the campaigns. Thanks for joining us this morning on Face the State. And you can join David and I in 2 weeks. We'll be having a debate over Initiative 185, the initiative on tobacco taxes and Medicaid expansion. Thanks once again for joining us on Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.